May the search for knowledge and truth bring us even closer to the divine. Welcome back, and let our journey begin.
Now, odds are pretty high that all of you have heard of Adam and Eve. You may also have heard of their first two sons, Cain and Abel. Genesis 4, the first two verses, is pretty clear about this. It reads as follows: Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now let's think about those two verses just for a moment. Adam knew Eve, his wife. To know a woman in biblical language is to have sexual relations. The word know is sort of a euphemism for sex in the Old Testament. So Adam knows Eve, she conceives, and bears Cain. Sounds pretty simple and straightforward. He killed his brother Abel, so things didn't go too well. But of course, when it comes to the wacky world of fringe Bible beliefs on the internet, nothing this straightforward can actually be this easy. Believe it or not, there are some who believe that Adam was not Cain's father, but instead Cain was fathered by the serpent in the Garden of Eden, Satan. And they even use the verses I just read to prove that idea. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, I didn't hear Satan in the verse. Where does Satan come in? The idea is called the serpent seed theory, and it's popular with certain anti-Semitic groups. There are basically three trajectories to constructing the idea. First, it has to be established that Cain's father was not the man Adam, but was instead a divine being. Now there's a grammatical ambiguity in the Hebrew text of Genesis 4:1 that's used to argue this point. Take a look at this picture of the Hebrew text of Genesis 4:1 with English translation. You'll notice that there's a small two-letter word in a red box. The two letters are Aleph and Tav, and the Hebrew word here is et. Now this little two-letter word can be understood in one of two ways. First, it could be viewed as a particle. It's called the accusative marker by Hebrew grammarians, and it marks the direct object of a verb. Now, the English translator in our sample took the word that way. The particle marks the direct object of two verbs, conceived and gave birth. It therefore identifies Cain as the child who was conceived in Eve and to whom she gave birth. Cain is the direct object of those verbs. Consequently, the marker receives no translation in our example. Now, the same two-letter word appears later in the verse in the green box. An alternative option is that the two-letter word could be a preposition that means with, as in accompaniment, she went with me, or assistance, I completed the task with a computer. The interpretive issue for our consideration is whether the two-letter word in Genesis 4:1 in the green box is an object marker like the first one, or this preposition. If what we see here is a preposition, the verse would read, I have conceived and given birth to a man with the Lord. The word Lord there is the divine name Yahweh. Now, serpent seed theorists use this alternative to separate Cain from Adam in terms of parentage. They know that Yahweh was not Satan, of course, so the goal of this argument is simply to plant the suggestion that Adam was not Cain's father because Eve got him with the Lord, or with the help of the Lord, a divine being. So to get his father as Satan, to move beyond this first argument, requires a few different things. There are two other arguments to this. So after planting the suggestion that Adam was not Cain's father, that maybe Eve got him through a divine being, the serpent seed theorists moved to a second trajectory. The content of what an ancient Targum, and a Targum is an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, what that Aramaic translation says in Genesis 4:1. Now the Targum I'm talking about specifically is Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. which says this: Adam knew his wife Eve, who had conceived from Samael, the angel of the Lord. This Aramaic translation adds an interesting note to this in the next verse. Then from Adam her husband she bore his twin sister and Abel. The ancient Targum clearly adds details not found in the Hebrew Old Testament that underlie our modern English translations. Cain's father is said to be Samael, the angel of the Lord. Now, this translation in the Aramaic Targum has no basis in any Hebrew manuscript of Genesis. It's entirely contrived, it's made up. Now, beyond that, serpent seed theorists add another thought. They go to Genesis 5:3 from the same Aramaic Targum to bolster their notion to this point, which reads this: When Adam had lived 130 years, he begot Seth, who resembled his image and likeness. For before that, Eve had borne Cain, who was not from him and who did not resemble him. Now, this wording denies that Cain was from Adam. Cain was not from him and did not resemble him. The father of Seth was Adam, who resembled his father, but that wasn't true about Cain. Now, modern English translations based on the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, not Aramaic, in Genesis 5:3, believe it or not, appear to convey a similar idea with a different wording. It reads as follows: When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. Now, even though there's no editorial comment about Cain not being like Adam, we don't get any information in Genesis 5:3 about Cain, and so we have an argument from omission. The point is that in Genesis 5:3, Seth is described as being in Adam's own lineage and likeness, but back in Genesis 4:1, Cain was not described that way. Remember what it says? Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. There's no reference to being in the image and likeness of Adam. Now this implies, so the theory goes, that Cain had a different father, and that father was the serpent, Samael, according to this Targum. Now, this brings us to the last trajectory upon which the serpent seed idea is based. The New Testament is now brought into the discussion to suggest that Cain was born of unnatural means. The presumed evidence is 1 John 3:11 and 12, at least the first part of verse 12. It reads as follows: For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. The question of Cain's origins arises from the phrase, who was of the evil one. Now, serpent seed theorists consider this wording a reference to Cain's satanic parentage. Then they take us to John 8:44, which says, You are of your father, the devil, to argue that Jews are also from the line of Cain, because that's who Jesus was talking to in John 8:44. You are of your father, the devil. This in turn requires that they prove Jesus was not a Jew, since Jesus is the one excoriating the Pharisees in that verse. This is why the serpent seed theory is an idea favored by anti-Semites. Is this reconstruction that I've just given you coherent? Well, let's find out. Nowhere in the Hebrew text is there any hint that Yahweh is Samael or Satan or anyone else but himself, Yahweh. So to conceive a child with the help of the Lord doesn't necessarily point to an alternative father besides Adam. The idea is fabricated in the Targum. The Targum just inserts the idea in these verses and the other ones that we read. Now, in addition, the Targum is dated with confidence to the 7th or 8th century AD. That means that Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, which is the lone source for this content insertion, is over 1,000 years after the latest possible composition of Genesis 4. It's a millennium separation. Eve is simply expressing her belief in Genesis 4:1 that she needed Yahweh's power or help to bring forth human life. Remember, Cain is her first child. She's never had this experience before. There are many other births in the Old Testament that are credited to God's help as well. You have Sarah giving birth to Isaac. You have Hannah giving birth to Samuel. Again, there's no hint of any intercourse there with those women, just like back in Genesis 4. So what we have here is just an expression of faith. Eve says, I've gotten a child with the help of the Lord. Somehow she believes that God was responsible for having the birth succeed, for actually giving birth to a child. She knows that Adam is the father because Adam knew Eve, his wife. There's no ambiguity there. And if we take, again, that phrase, with the help of the Lord, it doesn't mean that Eve had sex with Yahweh or any other divine being. Now you might say, well, what about 1 John 3, 11 and 12? I mean, that sounded convincing maybe. Let me read it to you again. For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. Now, not surprisingly, the serpent seed view of these verses bites the dust when you don't rip these verses from their context. Let's look at verse 10. By this it is evident who are the children of God and who are the children of the devil. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is the one who does not love his brother. If you go to verse 15, again in the same chapter, verse 15 states in more general terms that, quote, everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, unquote, like Cain. So by serpent seed logic, every follower of Jesus would have to literally be spawned by God, and everyone who sins was literally fathered by Satan, as well as anybody who hates anyone else. That means the devil is literally your father. Again, serpent seed logic here leads to these sorts of ridiculous conclusions. The contrast in 1 John 3 is between the spiritual children of God and the children of the devil, spiritually. Cain is the archetype of those who are lost, who are not believers, who are not Christians.
If you found this video enjoyable, please consider liking and sharing it. Additionally, subscribing to this channel will ensure that you receive more updates in the future.